glance passed over you as if you were invisible. No one hears you speak. No one needs you there. And when you leave, not a single person turns back. Have you ever been in a room where every glance passed over you as if you were invisible? No one hears you speak. No one needs you there. And when you leave, not a single person turns back. Maybe you tried to make yourself more noticeable, dressed better, smiled more, nodded at every word others said even when you didn't agree inside. But the more you tried to be accepted, the more you were pushed away. The more you hoped to be respected, the more you were dismissed. Because people do not respect those who beg for it. They respect those they cannot ignore, even when that person says nothing at all. And then you learn this. Respect is not a privilege others grant you. It is a result of every reaction you choose to withhold. It is a consequence of the calm you protect when others try to provoke you. It is a quiet space where you do not need to win the argument, yet others know they cannot control you. No one is born respected, but you can become the kind of person others don't dare to disrespect. On this path, you won't need to raise your voice. You won't need to retaliate. You'll only need 18 actions seemingly quiet, but powerful enough to make the world adjust its attitude in response to your presence. 1. You don't need to shout to be heard. Just be quiet enough to be felt. Some people talk more than necessary, not because they have something to share, but because they fear that silence will make them invisible. In a noisy world, people often confuse volume with value, presence with attention, and being heard with merely making noise. But there's a simple truth that only those who've walked through the shadows of isolation understand. You don't need to shout for others to stop and listen. You only need enough stillness to make your presence impossible to ignore. True silence doesn't lie in the absence of words, but in the absence of needing to speak. People respect those who know when to remain silent, not because that silence is empty, but because it signals an inner strength that never needed to be flaunted. The more people rush to insert themselves into conversation, the more they fight for airtime, the clearer it becomes. Power doesn't lie with the one holding the microphone, but with the one who slows down the entire room simply by walking in without uttering a word. When you enter a space with an unguarded calm, others sense something they can't quite name. It's not coldness, and it's not detachment. It's an unspoken message. I don't need to speak to be acknowledged, because my worth isn't measured by being heard, but by how I show up. True respect isn't built on performance, it's built on the feeling you leave in others' minds, that you're strong enough not to prove anything, and still enough not to react to everything. The Stoics never wagered their presence on words. They didn't see speech as a weapon for dominance, but as a last resort, used only when silence was no longer enough. In the art of conduct, what makes you memorable is not what you say, but what you choose not to say, and why you chose silence at that moment. Well-timed silence is a language more powerful than any argument. It shows you are observing, not reacting, choosing, not being pulled, present, not absorbed. Silence is also a mark of an inner life that has matured. When you still crave validation, you'll talk too much. When you fear being misunderstood, you'll explain yourself. But when you understand yourself deeply, you stop forcing others to understand. And that very detachment makes people start to want to listen to you, not because you did something special, but because you no longer need anything from them. There are rooms where you don't have to be the one who starts the conversation, because your quiet is already the opening line. There are moments when you don't need to speak up to confront wrong, because your silent gaze has already drawn the line. And there are relationships where you don't need to explain who you are, because the consistency of your presence already speaks for you. People always doubt those who talk too much, but they always tread carefully around those calm enough to say nothing at all. In the modern world, where everyone scrambles to speak, where the loudest voice gets attention regardless of truth, keeping a personal realm of silence is an act of resistance. But it's also an act of wisdom. When you're no longer driven by the urge to respond to everything, you begin choosing the battles that are worth your voice. And from then on, every word you speak will carry 10 times the weight of those who talk incessantly to drown their invisible fears. Respect does not begin with others. It begins the moment you refuse to react to what isn't worthy. And respect is not something you demand. It is the natural outcome of the calm you maintain when you had every right to erupt. Every time you choose silence over argument, you're affirming to the world that you will not be dragged into chaos, and that whether they understand it or not is what makes others hesitate to disrespect you. Your silence is the firm ground others must tread lightly upon. It does not boast. It doesn't need a spotlight. But it's the very thing that sets you apart from the crowd scrambling for attention. You don't need to stand out to be seen. You only need to show up in a way no one can overlook. And then one day, you'll realize you no longer need to try to be heard, because your very silence is what forces others to pause and for the first time, truly begin to listen. 2. Respect begins with how you enter a room. You walk into a room. No one knows who you are. No one pays attention, and no one is obligated to. But in that very moment, how you enter determines whether people continue to ignore you or quietly adjust how they sit, how they look, how they speak. You haven't said a word, but your body has. Your eyes have sent a signal. The rhythm of your breath is already a presence others can't help but notice. Respect doesn't begin with titles, attire, or applause. It begins with something quieter. Posture. Not just physical posture, but inner posture. It's the steadiness you carry when you no longer need to prove you're better than anyone. It's the composure you show when you have no desire to steal the spotlight. It's the way you walk in as if you know exactly where you are, why you're here, and need no one's validation to confirm it. A person with posture is not someone who stands tall, but someone who does not bow internally to any atmosphere. People often think that to make an impression, they have to say something remarkable. But in truth, the deepest impression comes from someone who walks in without demanding attention, yet causes others to instinctively turn their heads. Not because of noise, not because of style, but because of a solid energy that seeks no approval. Respect begins with the sense that you don't need them, but you don't look down on them either. You arrive with a standard not higher than others, but never lower than yourself. Some walk into a room as if asking for permission to exist. They scan nervously, shrink themselves, try to figure out how to start without standing out. And then there are those who walk in as if the room cannot define them. It's just a space where they'll leave a mark, whether they choose to speak or not. They don't rush, nor do they drag their steps to create effect. Each step says clearly, I'm not here to compete for a spot because I already have my own. The Stoics understood that the energy you carry is your first message. They didn't walk in to control others, they walked in with full control over themselves. And that very control gave them power. Not the power that overwhelms others, but the kind that makes others recalibrate their presence. They're not afraid of you, but your presence makes them more aware of their own. That's when you don't need to command, and yet the world straightens itself around you. Not everyone is born confident, but everyone can train something even more enduring: self-mastery. When you enter a room with the mindset that you don't need to become anyone else, you're already different. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to speak first. You only need to enter as if your silence carries gravity. And from that moment on, you start shaping a space where others must adjust their frequency to match yours, not through dominance, but through unshakable presence. Your posture is what people read before you speak. They read how you hold your shoulders, how fast or slow you walk, whether you meet eyes or avoid them. But more importantly, they read whether you're entering with fear of judgment or with the peace of knowing no one but you defines your worth. Someone entering with fear will talk too much, laugh too quickly, and try to connect through things that don't matter. Someone entering with inner calm will choose every word, every glance, and every moment with presence, not performance. Respect comes from what is unspoken. And if you want to build that, start with how you enter every room in life. Not just physical rooms, but psychological rooms, conversations, relationships, social dynamics. Do you enter a relationship with the posture of someone asking to be loved, or someone who knows what they carry and is ready to share it, not to be needed, but to grow together? Do you enter a job hoping to be kept, or with the posture that you will contribute as an extension of your own values? The way you enter a room, in every sense, teaches others how to receive you. If you enter with a self still craving affirmation, you'll only receive skepticism. But if you enter with a self already affirmed from within, you need no one's support, and for that reason, you will be heard. In a world where everyone is trying to stand out, the one who walks in calmly without needing to impress becomes the one who cannot be ignored. And so, every meeting, every space you walk through, every room you've ever entered will begin to feel different. Not because you've changed your stride, but because you've changed the way you stand with yourself. And respect, once something others gave you, now becomes something you carry with you like a quiet field of gravity no one dares to violate. 3. The interrupter isn't the problem. Your reaction is the answer. Each of us will eventually encounter that type of person. The ones who don't listen to understand, but wait to interrupt. The ones who don't care what you're saying, but are impatient to insert their own message. To them, dialogue isn't about sharing, it's a stage. Not for connection, but for control. And so, they don't see interruption as rude. To them, it's a way to seize control, but what they fail to understand is this. They can't truly take power when they interrupt unless you hand it over through your own reaction. Interruption isn't dangerous unless you treat it as an attack. It's just an action, and every action lies outside your control. What you can control is only your reaction. You can get angry. You can try to interrupt back. You can use sharp words to reclaim attention. But each of these choices pulls you into the game they have already set. The game of dominance, ego, and impatience dressed in polite words. And the moment you react too fast, too much, too personally, you've confirmed they have the power to pull you in. The Stoic does not react out of pride. They react out of necessity. And, in most cases of interruption, the necessary thing is this. Don't react. Not because you're passive, not because you're weak, but because you know your presence isn't erased by a few words cutting in. When you pause, lean back, and watch them hijack the conversation and manipulate the space, you are silently shifting roles from participant to observer. And the observer always holds the real power. You don't need to retaliate. Just look them in the eye. Don't look away. Don't tense up. Just hold your gaze as if you're waiting for them to finish their performance. And when they stop, if you still want to continue, simply say, "I wasn't finished." That's it. No need to destroy them with logic. No need to overpower them with volume. Just one calm, timely sentence carrying unmistakable clarity from within is enough to make them feel out of control. Not because you took the power back, but because you never gave it away. Every time you let emotions dictate your words, you're handing them exactly what they want. A reason to discredit you, an excuse to say you're weak, reactive, out of control. But when you let calmness lead, you don't just remain composed, you force others to confront their own behavior. The interrupter stops being the center when you don't give them the spotlight. And when they're left standing in the light without an opposing voice, they begin to look isolated in the very space they tried to dominate. You can't teach others to listen through lectures, but you can make them listen by refusing to let them interrupt your presence. No need to shout, no need to walk away, just stay rooted. Because respect isn't granted, it's reclaimed through the dignity you never bargain. When you refuse to retreat from yourself, even when interrupted, you are not cut off, you are merely pausing, ready to continue when the right moment returns. There are times you stay silent out of wisdom, but there are also times you speak again out of self-respect. The distinction lies in whether you're in control. If you continue because you choose to, you're in command. If you continue because you're angry, you're being led. In every conversation, real power doesn't belong to the loudest speaker, but to the one who speaks at the right time. And if that time hasn't come, the Stoic will wait, just as they wait for truth to rise when all lies are tired from contradicting themselves. Interrupting is common in the modern world where people are obsessed with being heard, seen, acknowledged instantly. But you don't have to live at that speed. You can choose your own pace. And in that world, it is precisely your slowness, steadiness, and well-timed stillness that becomes a form of strength even the most impulsive will respect. Because they realize you cannot control someone who doesn't need a reaction, and you cannot break someone who has never shaken to begin with. And then, there will come a moment when those who once interrupted you will be the ones trying to resume the conversation. Because when you no longer try to continue but retain your value in silence, they will understand that there's something about you that cannot be dismissed. Something that makes them feel small within their own noise. Something that reminds them there are people who don't need to interrupt to stay at the center. 4. Well-timed silence, a declaration without sound. There are times you speak a lot, yet no one truly listens. And there are times you say nothing, yet every eye in the room turns toward you. The weight of silence doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the message withheld. When you know you could speak, but choose not to, it is that restraint that echoes louder than any voice. Because well-timed silence is not a retreat, but a choice. It's a declaration that needs no sound yet demands to be heard by the mind. Silence is not for the fearful. It belongs to those who know that words aren't always necessary. Not every battle deserves a reaction. Not every offense is heavy enough to deserve a defense. Those who are not strong enough always need to be heard. Those who've moved beyond the obsession with proving themselves become selective with every word. And sometimes, saying nothing is your way of declaring, "I'm not playing this game. I don't answer questions that don't deserve to be asked, and I won't lower my dignity to respond to hollow noise." There are moments you're in the middle of a debate where everyone is rushing to speak louder, faster, deeper to prove their point. And in that moment you choose silence. You don't leave the space, but you withdraw from its chaos. You don't let emotion lead. You don't let ego fuel your response. And when that silence stretches, something shifts. People pause. They get uneasy. They wait for you to say something, but you remain quiet. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you're letting unnecessary words pass over like wind across water, creating no waves, no resistance, no trace. Well-timed silence is the boundary of the self-governed. It's a kind of power that needs no proof. When you don't answer a provocation, you haven't lost. You've just refused to play on someone else's terms. When you don't justify yourself against distortion, you're not weak. You simply understand that truth doesn't need defense, only time. And when you don't argue with someone unwilling to understand, you haven't given up. You're conserving your energy for places that deserve it. The Stoics knew this well. Epictetus once said, "A person who has achieved serenity will not rush to speak just to be seen." The challenge of silence is not in not speaking, it's in knowing you could speak, and still choosing not to. Like a warrior keeping his weapon sheathed, not because he lacks skill, but because he knows that fighting drags him into the realm of the immature. That silence is not weakness. It is control, not over others, but over oneself. And in a world obsessed with controlling the external, the one who can master well-timed silence controls the very core. You'll meet people who like to stir peace with sarcasm, backhanded remarks, and attitudes that undermine the values you uphold. They'll try every way to provoke a reaction, not because they care about you, but because your silence exposes the hollowness of their noise. When you react, they have an excuse to attack. When you speak, they have a reason to deny. But when you remain silent, every arrow they fire falls to the ground. No impact, no echo, no reception, and that's when they are forced to face themselves because there's nowhere left to shift blame. Well-timed silence is also an act of kindness to yourself. You don't need to react to defend because you know you're not under threat. You don't need to argue to prove you're right because you don't need others to confirm it. And you don't need to explain your pain for others to understand, because healing doesn't come from the sympathy of outsiders, but from the steadiness within your own mind. When you stay silent at the right moment, you give yourself the space not to become someone else's reflex, not to be an extension of their anger, and not to be absorbed by the chaos outside. In every relationship, whether with strangers, loved ones, or with yourself, silence is a kind of measurement. It measures how well you understand what deserves words and what should be left to silence. Not all silence is right, but all well-timed silence carries a form of dignity. And dignity, once upheld in the moments where you could have shattered, becomes a strength no one can take away. And so, among the thousands of words spoken daily, among the hundreds of unconscious reactions, among the countless times you wanted to scream just to be understood, you begin to realize you don't need all of that to affirm your worth. Because sometimes, well-timed silence is the clearest declaration. I am here. I see clearly, but I choose to remain outside, because I am strong enough not to be pulled in, and I am deep enough not to need volume to be present. 5. Don't retaliate against laughter. Make them repeat what they just said. There is a kind of weapon that leaves no physical scar, but cuts straight into your dignity, mocking laughter. It doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes, just a faint chuckle, a sideways glance, or a half joke is enough to freeze someone in place. People don't need to shout in your face to diminish you. All they have to do is release a smile into the air that says, "You're ridiculous," and let your own mind finish the rest. But what wounds you isn't the laugh, it's how you react to it. Don't retaliate. Don't puff up and strike back. Don't try to put them down the way they just did to you. Because in doing so, you've trapped yourself in a battle you never needed to fight. Reacting the way they want is an admission that they've touched your weakness, and that's exactly their win. But if you pause, look them straight in the eye, and calmly ask, "Would you mind repeating what you just said?" Their weapon instantly loses its power. No laugh remains sharp when dragged into the light of seriousness. People laugh to hide intent, laugh to belittle while maintaining innocence, laugh to deliver a message without being held accountable for it. But when you ask them to repeat their words out loud and clearly, you're dragging them out of that half-joke shell. You're saying, "I see what you're doing, and I won't let you mask it as humor." In that moment, you're not attacking, you're exposing a cowardly avoidance. You're not retaliating, you're just returning them to their rightful place. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Do not let your soul become ugly because of what others do to you." The Stoic doesn't react from instinct but from awareness. They don't let anger consume their dignity, nor allow injury to cloud their clarity. In every situation, especially when mocked, they choose calmness as protection, not to avoid, but to preserve their boundary. Because every time you react to hurt someone back, you're admitting they had the power to hurt you. But when you calmly ask them to repeat what they just laughed at, you disarm them with the strength of your integrity. The mocking person doesn't want you to be clever. They want you to be weak or angry, because both of those reactions place you in a defensive stance. But when you meet their words with cold clarity and ask, "What was that you said?" you're not defending, you're shifting the spotlight. You're not getting pulled into the game, you're dragging the game into the light. And it's that very clarity that throws them off. Because ridicule only works in the shadows of ambiguity. It collapses under the gaze of someone too grounded to flinch. You don't have to respond to every insult, but you must protect the space you occupy. Not with aggression, but with clarity. When you ask a question, you're re-establishing your boundary. When you show no sign of being hurt, you're preserving your dignity. And when you look at someone who just laughed at you with unshaken presence, you're showing them that you can't be manipulated by half-hearted jabs. That's not silent submission. That's refusal to play a rigged emotional game with someone unworthy. Wisdom doesn't lie in knowing what to say, but in knowing when nothing needs to be said at all. Greater wisdom is knowing when you do speak, you force the other person to confront themselves not with accusation, but with a question they can't dodge. A well-timed question can end an entire charade, collapse cheap humor, and force the one mocking you to choose. Either own what they just said or withdraw in awkward silence. Sometimes you'll feel the urge to strike back immediately. You'll want to say something even sharper. You'll want to make them feel exactly what you're feeling. But then you realize, retaliating against laughter is the act of someone who hasn't yet mastered self-respect. But making them repeat what they just said with calm precision is the act of someone calling their morality into question. And that question doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be asked gently, but at the right moment, through unwavering eyes. And then, you'll witness something strange. The laugh doesn't echo anymore. The other person is no longer so at ease. The air shifts. You didn't take revenge. You didn't argue. But you made the one who laughed look into their own shadow, and that is a punishment few can endure. Because in that moment, you are no longer the target of ridicule. You are the one holding the mirror. And no one enjoys seeing themselves clearly in a mirror that clean. 6. When they bring up the past, let them stay stuck in it. There are people who never speak of the present. They don't ask who you are now, what you're doing, or what you think today. They only bring up the day you failed, the moment you collapsed, the mistake you've already left behind. They repeat it as if your past is a life sentence that can never be lifted. They laugh, but the laughter isn't rooted in the present. It stretches from a place you've long moved past. And what hurts most isn't that they remember, it's that they need you to go back there with them. But you don't need to go back. You owe no one a return trip. Those who bring up what's past are those who've never moved forward themselves. Memory, when used for understanding, becomes a lesson, But when used to chain others down, it becomes a shackle. And the Stoics knew clearly, no one should live in chains held by someone else. The past cannot be changed, but it cannot imprison you unless you walk back into it yourself. People love using your past to define you because they fear the version of you they can no longer control. They don't bring up your old failures out of concern, but because they're afraid you've grown beyond the image they once held. By pulling you back to what was, they're trying to say, I'm still above you because I remember when you were beneath me. What they fail to realize is this. While they live by memory, you live by awareness. And nothing scares someone more than watching a person who once broke now walk calmly as if they never shattered. You don't need to explain. You don't need to prove anything. Just keep living aligned with a self that the past no longer governs. You don't need to rewrite anyone's memories. Because if someone clings to an old image of you to feel like they're progressing, you're not responsible for pulling them out. They'll stay stuck inside the narrow room they built to trap others, while convincing themselves they're still ahead. But you're no longer part of that game. And because of that, you're no longer easily manipulated. The Stoics didn't deny the past. They faced it, learned from it, then moved on. They didn't let what happened become their identity. They let it become the foundation for something more solid. When someone brings up the past to belittle you, you don't need to erase it. Just look at them not with resentment, not with pain, but with the stillness of someone who has learned what they've never dared to learn. Because someone who keeps speaking of the past reveals that their present isn't strong enough to believe in. Yes, you've made mistakes, been naive, failed. But all of that led you here to a life of greater consciousness. The one who brings up the past can't undo that. They only expose their own attachment. And you don't have to drag them with you nor fight them. Just keep walking, quietly. Let them stay where they choose, trapped in the shadow of a time that once held you, but no longer defines you. Dignity isn't about never failing. It's about refusing to let failure become your residence. Every time someone drags you back to the day you broke, remember they live there, not you. And the truth is, those who live in the past often need others to stay with them so their stagnation feels justified. But you don't have to live their emotions for them. Your growth doesn't need their approval. It is strong enough to continue whether recognized or ridiculed. When you choose silence in the face of mockery about your past, you're not weak, you've simply gone too far to walk back and justify it. When you no longer try to repair others' impressions of your former self, you're not cold, you just know your present energy belongs to what can change, not what's already dead. And when you let them repeat the old story without flinching, you're showing that you don't react because you're no longer who they knew. In the end, the one who clings to the past is the one who hasn't moved. And the one who stays silent, grounded, is the one who's built a life where memories no longer rule. And that person doesn't need to shout they've changed. They just live calmly, deeply, without turning back to clarify or begging to be understood. They let time testify, they let results speak, and they let the past rest, like a book long finished even if someone keeps reopening the pages. 7. When they reopen old wounds, shift the frame with an unrelated question. Some people don't come to check in, they come to reopen. They don't care what you've overcome, they only care that the wound is still there, still pink beneath the healed skin, still aching enough to make you freeze when someone touches it. And they touch not out of care, but to see how you'll react. These people don't speak of healing. They just pick up an old knife and press into a place where they once saw you bleed, not because they hate you, but because they can't stand your newfound strength. In that moment, you have many options. You can defend, you can retaliate, you can stay silent. But there's another choice, quiet, sharp, and wise. Redirect. Not to avoid, but to rob them of the satisfaction of watching you collapse again. When someone brings up pain you've once endured, look them in the eye and ask a completely unrelated question, light enough not to seem evasive, yet unexpected enough to disrupt their grip on the conversation. "Oh, by the way, cold weather today, huh? Do you remember that coffee spot from college? What podcast are you listening to lately?" One small question, simple, seemingly random, but just enough to take back the wheel. They can't continue their performance when you refuse to follow the script. And the lightness in your response will confuse them, unsure whether to keep attacking, to laugh awkwardly, or to quietly back out of the emotional game they assumed you were still fragile enough to play. You don't have to expose your scars to prove they've healed. You don't need to forbid people from mentioning the past, but you have the right not to let them control the timing, the context, or the state of mind in which you revisit it. By steering the conversation elsewhere, you're not denying the pain. You're saying to yourself, "I don't live there anymore." And the Stoic always guards their own mind, never handing it over to those who fail to understand how sacred healing truly is. Redirection isn't avoidance, it's the art of choosing. When you shift the subject with grace, you're saying, "I know what you're doing, but I'm not playing that game anymore." You stay composed. You don't twist the air with tension. You don't respond like someone wounded, and that's what confuses them. The one who once saw you shattered now finds no crack to press into, and in their world, the most unsettling thing is having nothing left to cling to when trying to control you through your past. An unrelated question, delivered at just the right moment, doesn't only change the topic, it changes the emotional state. The tension breaks, the assault loses momentum, and you don't need hostility to do it, just equanimity. Because real strength doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from refusing to get dragged into endless battles. A wound, if constantly exposed to prove it's healed, will never truly heal. But if you can carry it silently, live on, and still smile, then you are no longer ruled by it. Epictetus once said, "We are not hurt by events, but by our view of them." The one who brings up old wounds isn't always cruel. Maybe they have never known the feeling of suffering in silence, never understood what it means to rise from ruin alone. Or maybe they do, and that's why they test you. They want to see if you're still the same, and you don't have to prove a thing. That question you ask, seemingly light, is the clearest message. I'm not in that place anymore. You may stand there if you wish, but I'm moving forward. When others bring up what once hurt you, they expect you to return to that scar. But you can choose to move on, not out of avoidance, but because you've learned the lesson. And the most precious part of growing up isn't that you no longer feel pain, it's that you're no longer controlled by the person who reminds you of it. A question that seems inconsequential becomes a fence around your peace. Not because you're afraid, but because you no longer need to revisit what you've already outgrown. You don't have to say, "Don't bring it up." No need to walk away. No need to be harsh. Just one soft sentence at the right moment, completely unrelated, and continue as if none of it ever rattled you. They'll be left wondering, because nothing unsettles someone more than when their expected reaction isn't returned. And nothing makes someone who tries to reopen wounds feel more powerless than realizing you no longer let them reach you. 8. Control the frame by refusing to play their game. True power doesn't lie in what you say first. It lies in defining the frame of the conversation. Whoever sets the frame guides the outcome. But the frame isn't built with opening lines. It's shaped by how you respond, what you choose to address, and what you choose to leave untouched. A loaded question, a provoking remark, a tone laced with disrespect, all are crafted to drag you into a game where they control the rules. And in that moment, you must do the opposite. Don't play. When someone tries to bait you into a humiliating or hurtful situation, they don't just want you angry, they want you to react inside the frame they built. They want you to defend, explain, argue, strain yourself, trying to prove what never needed proving. They're holding the strings, and the moment you step in, they can pull you in any direction. But what if you don't step in? What if you just stand there, calm, not agreeing, not denying? What if you decline the game from the start? The entire frame collapses. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If you remain silent and keep yourself from being drawn in, you'll see things become much simpler." The Stoic doesn't win by out-debating others, they win by never letting others define the space. They master themselves. And it's that self-command that confounds manipulators, because for once, they don't know the rules you're playing by, or if you're playing at all. Refusing to engage isn't retreat, it's the highest strategy. In complex conversations, the one in control isn't the loudest, it's the one who can create the perfect silence, making others wonder, why aren't they reacting? And in that space, every falsehood reveals itself, every jab falls flat, and the game starter finds themselves with no path forward. You can shift the frame with a glance, by not answering, by changing the subject, or simply by being so composed that they lose interest. You don't need to dominate the conversation. You just need to reset the terms by refusing to react automatically. When they set traps, you don't step in. When they provoke, you don't strike back. When they tell a story that blames you, you don't justify. That refusal to participate is the reversal. You don't fight for control. You remove the power by not validating the game. Many fear that if they don't respond, don't argue, don't react, they'll be misunderstood. But you weren't born to manage everyone's perception. You weren't born to explain yourself in every room. Grown adults don't need to prove they need to stay awake. And the most awake are those who can discern which battles are worth playing and which games must be left to avoid losing themselves. Controlling the frame doesn't mean controlling others. It means defining the scope of what you're willing to engage with. When you decline to speak on toxic topics, when you don't fall into defensive posture, when you respond with a neutral answer to a loaded question, you're building an invisible boundary. And the quieter that fence, the stronger it is. Because people can twist your words, but they can't puncture a mind that doesn't react. There's great power in not reacting predictably. When you change your reaction, you change the entire course of the dialogue. And gradually, you won't just master yourself, you'll influence how others behave around you. Not to manipulate, but to stay unmanipulated. Because people can only control you if you still react how they expect. Step outside of that, and you not only protect your peace, you force them to rebuild the entire game. You'll notice this most clearly when someone deliberately tries to offend you directly or indirectly, hoping for an outburst. But you don't give it to them. You just smile, or stay silent, or toss back a harmless question. And that dissonance unsettles them. They can't read you. They've lost the frame. And if you hold this long enough, you won't just master today's conversation, you'll shape how others interact with you from now on. And then you'll see, respect isn't built with loud voices or sharp words. It's built from the refusal to participate in what doesn't deserve your presence. From knowing who you are without shouting it. From never stooping just to react, and from quietly shifting the atmosphere, simply by not letting others define who you become in a conversation. 9. Leave when you're no longer heard, not out of weakness, but clarity. There are conversations that no longer feel like exchanges. They turn into conditional monologues. You speak, but no one truly listens. They're just waiting for you to stop so they can resume defending their point. They nod, but their eyes have drifted. They ask, but don't wait for the answer. They listen not to understand, but to refute. And if you keep speaking in a room like that, you're not communicating, you're draining yourself. Not because your words are wrong, but because the space no longer holds room for sincere reception. People often confuse leaving with giving up. They assume that if you walk away, you've surrendered. But what the Stoic understands clearly is this: there are conversations not worth continuing, and people not worth trying harder for. You don't withdraw out of weakness, but because your presence no longer adds value in that space. And when you realize that, you don't need to make a scene or declare anything. You simply stand up and walk away in silence, with dignity and tact. You don't leave because you can't endure any longer. You leave because there's nothing to prove by enduring at all. Boundaries aren't always drawn with words. Sometimes your footsteps leaving a place no longer worthy of your presence are the clearest boundary of all. When you no longer feel heard, and when your words are twisted, dismissed, or devalued, you have the right to walk away, not to escape someone, but to protect what you're building within yourself. Adults don't always need to be understood, but they do need to be heard. Listening doesn't require agreement, but it is the bare minimum form of respect. When you speak and someone isn't truly present, they're not just ignoring you, they're teaching you how little they value you. And if you learn that lesson, you'll understand that continuing is a form of self-erasure. Walking away in that case isn't abandoning them. It's refusing to abandon yourself. You can sit there longer, try harder, explain more. But there's a point beyond which every effort is just pouring into an upside-down glass. The more you speak, the more depleted you become. The more silent they grow, the more desperate you feel. You cannot change that dynamic with words. And at some point, the bravest thing you can do isn't to keep being patient, but to stop with clarity. No one can truly hear you when they're only waiting to argue. And no one deserves your kindness in a place where it's treated lightly. Seneca once said, "The wise man chooses silence where reason no longer finds a place." This isn't surrender, it's the action of someone who knows which battlefield is not worth their dignity. You cannot force someone to listen, but you can choose where to speak. And more importantly, you can choose who deserves to hear you, because your words carry value, and that value is only preserved when you refuse to throw them into a place where no one understands their worth. Leaving in silence is the clearest kind of message. It's not an ending, but a quiet acknowledgement that you've become too aware to keep hoping in the wrong place. When you retreat from a deadlocked conversation, you're not hurting the other person, you're refusing to let them keep hurting you. And sometimes, people don't realize the value of a presence until it's no longer there. You don't need to leave behind an echo. Just leave behind enough silence for them to hear themselves. Some people don't listen because they're too used to hearing only themselves. Some spaces no longer have room for listening because it's been replaced by power, imposition, or prejudice. And at certain moments, staying is blindness, while leaving is wisdom. You owe no explanation. You owe no defense. Your exit is a form of declaration. I no longer need to be seen because I've seen enough. Not everyone will understand why you went silent or walked away, but they will feel the shift. No more long conversations, no more empty nods, no more physical presence while the mind drifts. In its place, quiet, absence, the hollow space where they once felt your presence. And if anyone is truly listening, they'll understand. Leaving didn't mean you stopped caring. It meant you cared too long in a place that gave nothing back. 10. Respect doesn't come from the crowd, but from how you leave it. The crowd is always loud. And in the noise, people confuse presence with value. That the more visible you are, the more often your name is mentioned, the louder the applause, the more respected you must be. But most of that recognition exists only in moments. It's lit by the need for attention, not by a true understanding of who you are. And because of that, the more you seek respect within the crowd, the further you drift from real respect. Because respect doesn't come from how many eyes are on you, but from the quality of the silence behind you when you walk away. Some people are only strong when standing in a circle others built. They exist by the crowd's reaction, by applause, praise, comparison, but that isn't strength, it's borrowing. And the Stoic knows anything borrowed from the outside can be taken back without notice. So if the respect you hold depends on where you are or who you are in the eyes of the crowd, it vanishes the moment you step out of the light. But there is another kind of person, one whose presence doesn't rely on a stage. They don't need to stand in the center to prove anything. They can quietly stand at the edge or walk out of the room without turning back and still make others look over. Not because they stirred the room, but because they made the silence heavier. And that is the truest sign of respect. When you leave, people begin to feel your presence more deeply than when you were there. Many spend their whole lives holding a spot in someone's heart, in an organization, in a relationship, afraid that if they withdraw, their value disappears. But the Stoic knows real value isn't lost when you leave the crowd. It's revealed more clearly. The way you leave, not flamboyant, not resentful, not needing to be understood, is what makes others silently wonder, why would someone like that not need to hold on? That question plants quiet respect deeper than any loud declaration could. You don't need to stay in a place where your presence survives only through constant effort. If you must constantly prove, explain, compete to keep your place, then that is not a space built on respect. True respect doesn't exhaust you to maintain it. It grants you peace even when no one claps. And sometimes your silent departure ends a game you never wanted to play. It's a door that closes without sound, yet opens a space no one can ignore. Epictetus once said, "Remember that you need not appear everywhere, nor be mentioned in every story." A strong inner life needs no crowd for its backdrop. You can sit in the corner of a cafe, do your work, live by your principles, and still be respected. Not because you're loud, but because you're unwavering. And if one day you walk away from a place where you were once admired and recognized, but no longer feel you belong, then walk away. Because respect doesn't come from how long you stayed in someone's heart, but from knowing exactly when to leave. Some departures bring relief. Some leave a room empty. But some departures silence the entire space. People no longer speak much, they just fall quieter. They recall the times you didn't need to argue. Recall how you held your place without struggle. Recall how you stood firm while others wavered. And they realize they once had someone calm enough never to overshadow, but deep enough to leave a void when gone. You don't need to stand out in a crowd to earn respect. You need to know when to walk away from it at the right time, in the right way, for the right reason. No need for a grand farewell, no need for loud marks. Just leave a standard behind that. I will not remain where I'm no longer myself. And that choice will be the greatest lesson you leave for anyone who witnessed your departure. 11. When you no longer need them to understand, they start to wonder why. People spend a great deal of time seeking to be understood. They explain, They justify. They open up. They chase after distracted eyes, hoping for just one moment of being truly heard. But the truth is, the more you try to be understood, the more likely you are to get lost in the maze of expectations and disappointment. Because not everyone has the sensitivity to listen deeply, and not everyone truly wants to understand you, many. Just listen to maintain their own role, not to touch the truth behind your words. Then comes a time when you no longer feel the need to explain. Not because you're arrogant, nor because you've given up, but because you've seen enough, felt enough, and experienced enough to know, if understanding must be begged for, it will never be deep enough to hold on to. You release that expectation not as a quitter, but as someone fully awake. You understand that what's worth keeping is not surface-level agreement, but the inner peace that comes from no longer depending on whether someone understands you or not. And in the moment you stop explaining, something strange happens. Those who once ignored you begin to feel uneasy. Those who believed they fully grasped you begin to sense there's something they missed. Your silence, rather than making you fade, becomes a question in their minds. Why don't they need me to understand anymore? That question lingers without an answer because you no longer hand them the same familiar script. You don't chase them with words, don't use emotion as a gateway, don't lay out the path for them to walk into your inner world. You close the door not to hide, but to protect the sacredness of what remains unspoken. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Do what is right, not for applause." And that is the principle of someone who lives by values. They do not build themselves upon others' reactions. They build upon the foundation of self-understanding, a form of knowledge so deep it needs no validation. When you no longer need someone to understand you, you are also no longer bound by what they think of you. The greatest freedom lies in the moment you stop chasing outside approval and begin the quiet conversation within. Silence, when not born of hurt but of strength, becomes a language with great weight. It does not speak, yet it causes others to question. It does not rebuke, but shallow judgments dissolve without being fed by reaction. You don't need to refute a false claim. You simply refuse to let it guide how you live. And that's what unsettles those who are used to your constant explanations, not because they care, but because they lose the power to control your emotions through their lack of understanding. There is a very quiet kind of strength in the posture of, "I don't need you to understand." It's not cold, not hostile, not withdrawn. It is simply the choice to reserve your energy for what matters more. You don't cut ties. You don't turn your back. You don't boycott. You simply stop waiting for them to catch up to your emotional rhythm. And when that waiting ends, you realize you don't need to move faster than anyone else. You just need to walk in the right direction. And sometimes your silence is the mirror that forces others to reflect. Epictetus once said, "Not everyone has the same capacity for understanding." And that's something you must learn to accept. You don't need to be understood by everyone. You just need to live in a way that doesn't betray yourself. If someone is truly deep enough, they will come to you not with questions, but with presence. The rest will continue guessing. They'll construct stories about you, interpret your motives, judge your actions through their limited lens, and none of that affects you anymore. Once you've learned how to exist without needing their comprehension. When you stop explaining, you return to others the responsibility they should have carried all along. The responsibility to understand, to observe, to refine their own perception. You no longer carry that burden for them. You don't bend yourself to fit into the narrow frame they've constructed. You maintain your full form, even if misunderstood, even if misrepresented, because you know that being true to yourself is worth more than being accepted by someone who never truly wanted to understand. And one day, when they look back, they will see. There was once someone who was willing to open up, to slow down, to wait, but they didn't care enough to truly listen. And when that person stepped away from the need to be understood, what they left behind wasn't an unfinished story, but a silent question that no one can answer except the one asking. 12. A calm person is always more dangerous than an angry one. Anger makes people yell, lash out, break things, and charge into conflict like a wounded beast. But calm, that's what silences an entire room. Anger is often a reflex, explosive, predictable, easy to manipulate, easy to dismantle. Calmness, on the other hand, is something else entirely. It leaves the opponent unable to read intent, predict reaction, or sense a stopping point. A calm person isn't emotionless. They're someone who holds the fire inside without letting it burn everything around them. While the angry lose control, the calm steer everything from the quiet. They don't speak much, but every action carries weight. They're never in a rush, but each move has purpose. They aren't satisfied by expression alone, because they know that what's truly terrifying isn't the scream, but the silence of someone who knows exactly what they're about to do next. And it's that composure that makes others uneasy, because no one gains an advantage when the expected reaction never arrives. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The strongest person is the one who can control themselves." In a world where everyone explodes easily, the one who stays still in the storm is not to be underestimated. They don't scream for victory. They observe, they listen, they analyze. They know when to speak and when to withdraw to prepare a deeper move. They don't play others' games, they reshape the entire board through their unshakable stillness. An angry person often loses sight of the goal in the midst of conflict because they respond from emotion. The calm person does not. They still see the bigger picture, still know their escape route, still keep their hand off the alarm. Not because they're weak, but because they refuse to be forced into hasty action. They understand that every word, every look, every gesture, if delivered from a place of calm, becomes a form of soft power that needs no volume to command. In every situation, the one who loses composure is the easiest to lead. They're provoked, pulled into the game, manipulated through reaction, but the one who maintains their stance, who doesn't let rage tear through their inner defenses, they're the ones who truly hold power. Because no one can manipulate someone who doesn't react as expected. You can't bring down someone who has already mastered their own emotions. They don't fight with reactions, they win through observation, patience, and timing. There are moments when calm isn't just an advantage, it's a warning. When people wait for you to explode and you don't, they get nervous. They don't know what you're thinking, don't know what you're preparing. And in that pause, recklessness begins to bloom. A wise person never lays all their cards on the table. They let others rush to reveal themselves, and then, with a single well-timed word, they end a chaotic assault without raising their voice. Epictetus once said, "If someone can make you angry, they've taken control of you." Anger is a trap. The wise don't walk into it. They don't prove they're not angry. They don't need to. Their silence is a form of psychological security, and those perceptive enough will understand. Calmness isn't weakness. It's the mark of someone no longer ruled by the trivial. You don't need to raise your voice to be respected. You don't need to get angry to prove right or wrong. You just need to stand firm long enough, strong enough, and let the chaos pass without it ever infecting your mind. Because in the end, the one who causes fear isn't the first to react, it's the one who reacts in ways no one expects. It's that unpredictability, that stepping outside of emotional habit that makes people wary. Some shout, curse, and thrash in helpless rage. And some say nothing at all, but their eyes hold a storm already mastered. They don't threaten, don't perform, don't need to prove. Yet their presence forces others to adjust. No one knows what they will do, but everyone knows. Don't push them to do it. You don't need to play the role of the angry to be formidable. Practice calmness as a form of inner discipline. Master every wave that rises in your chest, and let your composure become the loudest voice in the noisiest room. Because the angry may win a moment, but the calm, they win the entire game. 13. Don't seize power with words. Command it with your eyes. Words are the most used tool, yet the weakest when it comes to real power. Anyone can speak. Anyone can shout, argue, analyze, and debate. But the more words you use, the easier you are to read. The more you speak, the easier it is to lose your point. And the person trying to control the room with their voice is often the one trying to cover up a lack of true influence. The less power someone has, the more they feel the need to speak. Those with real presence don't need to say more than one sentence. While everyone is trying to be heard, some people simply look. Their gaze isn't aggressive, loud, or threatening, but it's impossible to ignore. Not because it demands your attention, but because it makes you reflect inward. A gaze that deep can do more than a full speech. It doesn't attack, but it forces others to step back. No words, no arguments, just presence. And those who know how to use their gaze to maintain order don't need approval to make things move their way. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Let your character speak through your silence." A Stoic does not seek power by grabbing the highest seat or drowning out others in conversation. They simply show up with such steadiness that others adjust themselves in response. Not because they pressure others, but because they don't have to. They don't challenge. They don't compete, but everyone knows. They anchor the energy in the room. And that doesn't come from what is said, it comes from self-mastery in the gaze. When you walk into a room and every eye turns to you, not because you're loud, but because you're silent, that is true control of the atmosphere. And to do that, you must know how to look, not to analyze others, but to confirm your presence. Those who don't need to show off are the ones who know their worth. They don't need to compete because they're not afraid to lose. They don't need to prove because they already hold inner recognition, and their gaze becomes the clearest expression of unspoken power. Those who speak too much are easily interrupted. Those who argue are easily led. But the one who simply observes makes others cautious. No one knows what that person is thinking. No one knows what they're noticing, and that mystery creates a reversed balance of power. When your gaze is steady, clear, and calm, you force those trying to control the situation to pause and reassess their approach. And in that pause, you've already taken the lead without saying a word. Epictetus once reminded, "You cannot control others, but you can control how you respond." And the gaze is the purest, most truthful response impossible to fake. It reflects your level of self-control, stillness, and awareness. A confused gaze invites suspicion. A regretful gaze invites pity. But a calm, sharp, fearless gaze reveals something others have yet to achieve. A being grounded amidst chaos. In power dynamics, the one who speaks most always loses. Because true power isn't about who speaks, but who makes others too careful to speak carelessly. And the one who can create silence with just a gaze holds the position without ever needing to fight for it. That is a kind of strength forged in silence. No one hands it to you, no one grants it. It comes only when you learn to see without flinching, to observe without reacting, and to wield your gaze like a blade that cuts through pretense. Some gazes make people feel safe. Others make them look away. But there's a kind of gaze that makes people straighten up when speaking to you, not because you ask, but because they feel compelled to. And if you can shift someone's posture without a single word, you don't need any other tool to hold power in your hand. Don't waste energy arguing where no words are needed. Don't seek persuasion by speaking louder. Train your gaze so it becomes a mirror of awareness. Let it prove that you've understood everything, yet remain silently composed. And when you look someone in the eye, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a calmness that says you've already seen the outcome, then every power game loses its effect. 14. Every step you take away is a step they must look back on. Some people walk fast to prove themselves. Others walk forcefully to intimidate. But there's a kind of step that's neither loud nor hurried, nor designed to draw attention, yet still makes everyone turn around. It's the step of someone who doesn't leave because they've lost, but because they've clearly seen the game is no longer worth playing. From a young age, we're taught that walking away means failure. That if you don't keep fighting, don't hold your ground, don't argue to the end you've lost. But the Stoic doesn't care what others think of their presence. They care about one thing only, whether their presence still preserves their integrity. And if the answer is no, they walk away, quietly, with self-control, without regret, because not all who retreat are weak, and not all who stay are strong. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Retreat is not surrender, it is a form of preserving the soul's purity." When you remain in a place where your value is constantly challenged, where you must repeatedly prove yourself, constantly defend, and keep adjusting to fit in, then leaving is not a defeat. It is a refusal to keep living in a distorted version of yourself. And your retreat is not about closing a door, but opening a silence that forces others to ask, why did that person choose to leave? Some people only recognize your value once you're no longer there. While you were present, they mistook your patience for weakness, your calm for passivity, your tolerance for submission. But when you leave that room, when your gaze no longer offers one more moment of quiet acceptance, when your voice no longer softens conflict, they begin to feel the emptiness. Not because you left, but because your presence had always been the glue holding things together. People often judge you by how you enter, but they're haunted by how you exit. A loud goodbye is easily forgotten, but a silent retreat leaves a long-lasting echo. Because it brings no explanation, no climax, no drama to ease the ego of those left behind. It leaves only a space cold, long, and quiet enough to force someone to confront what they never wanted to see. They had taken you for granted. When you stop trying to stay, stop persuading, stop adjusting, others are forced to ask themselves, were the things they once thought were not enough from you actually far more than they deserved? And that is the power of a quiet retreat. It's not about hurting, not about revenge, not about winning. It's simply a silent declaration. I choose to preserve my decency, and I will not let it be worn down any further. Epictetus said, "When you walk away from a toxic conversation, you don't lose your place, you reclaim your freedom." The one who no longer needs to be understood, no longer needs to argue, no longer needs recognition is someone who has moved far beyond the battle. They don't need to be right because they are no longer bound. They may call you a quitter. They may blame you for lacking perseverance. But one quiet night, they'll remember your eyes before you walked away, and they will realize you didn't lose, you just refused to play a game whose rules you never agreed to. And if you've ever felt guilty for walking away, remember this. Not all presence is a commitment. There are places you enter only to learn how to leave them at the right time. There are relationships you join only to realize peace comes not from holding on, but from knowing when to let go. And there are conversations you leave halfway, not because you have nothing more to say, but because you've understood that not everyone deserves your final word. 15. You don't need to defeat them. You only need not to lose yourself. We grow up with a distorted definition of strength that to earn respect, you must defeat someone. Be better than them. Prove something. Respond at the right moment. Strike back precisely. Counter quickly. We learn how to retaliate, but not how to remain ourselves. We're easily drawn into meaningless battles where the winner isn't the one who's right, but the one who talks longer, louder, or more cleverly. And while trying to defeat them, we lose ourselves without even realizing it. A Stoic doesn't seek victory in the outcome, but in how they hold their principles during conflict. They don't care who has the last word. They care only about this. After everything, are you still someone you respect? Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "When you are angry at someone, ask yourself, is their behavior worth trading your peace of mind?" That is the essence of every right choice, not to win, but to not betray yourself. In some situations, if you respond exactly how they want, you've already lost no matter what you say. Because you've stepped into their arena, let them control your heartbeat and voice. A calm person knows not every battle must be fought, and not every opponent is worth lowering your gaze for. You don't need to win. You just need to walk away still whole, still calm, still dignified, still kind. In the moment you choose silence over retaliation, walking away over yelling, forgiveness over revenge, you're protecting the most essential part of yourself. Not because you're weak, but because you understand your worth doesn't lie in anyone else's hands. They don't get to decide who you are. And you don't need validation from those too shallow to see your quiet effort each day. Victory isn't when they finally acknowledge you, but when you no longer need them to. The strongest person in the room isn't the one who manipulates every outcome, but the one who isn't manipulated by any. Who doesn't crumble when misunderstood, who doesn't fall when insulted, who doesn't react just because they're provoked. There are moments you'll be looked down on for not striking back, but eventually they'll realize your composure isn't emptiness, it's something too deep for them to disturb. And by the time they realize it, you've already walked too far for them to reach. Epictetus once said, "No one can harm you unless you allow them to." Harm doesn't come from others' words, it comes from your own permission. If you try to defeat them, you've already given them too much power. But if you stay clear, walk away without resentment, you prove this. Freedom doesn't come from what you do, but from not being forced to act against your own values. You don't need to win in the eyes of others. You only need not lose in your own. Because at the end of the day, it's only you who lives with your thoughts, faces your reflection, and knows what's true and what's not. You may be praised for shutting someone down with words, logic, or force. But if deep down you know you betrayed your principles, there is no victory worth celebrating. The world may honor those who claim victory, but Stoicism teaches you to honor those who never lose themselves even when they win nothing. These are the ones who know when to stop, when to leave, when to be silent, when to forgive. Not because they're weak, but because they understand. Nothing is more valuable than inner peace. And if they must choose between achieving something and remaining true, they'll choose the latter. You don't need to become a reflection of others just to defeat them. If they are petty, cruel, selfish, manipulative, defeating them with those same traits only makes you like them. And the painful truth is, you may win against them today, but lose yourself forever. So when you face insult, provocation, or pressure, remember, You don't need to win. You just need not lose yourself. Don't lose your calm. Don't lose your kindness. Don't lose your direction. And every time you do that, you don't just preserve your dignity, you make others reflect. How does someone who didn't try to win still make them feel like they've lost? 16. Reclaiming your position. From within, in silence. There are phases in life when you realize you've lost the standing you once held, not because of failure, but because you spent too much time pleasing others. You find yourself in rooms where your voice is no longer heard, your gaze no longer met, your presence no longer shifting anyone's behavior. And you ask yourself, what did I lose and when? The answer doesn't lie in one specific moment. It's the result of countless small choices when you stayed quiet once, backed down once, ignored one comment, forgave one wrong, until you traded the respect others had for you with a false peace. But then, one day, that tolerance cracks silently. No yelling, no blaming, just an expanding void and a decision to be made. Continue dissolving into others' expectations or quietly rebuild yourself from within. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Within each of us is a fortress. No one can invade it unless we open the door." Respect doesn't come from status or power or praise. It comes from a silent inner force forged on days when no one recognizes you. In moments you heal yourself in private, in choices you make without needing the world's permission. A Stoic waits for no rescue. They don't seek a place, they build one, on the foundation of discipline, clarity, and self-awareness. You don't need to announce your return. No need to write a post declaring you've changed. No need to wear something different just to be seen differently. You just begin step by step. Adjust your posture, gather your energy, reduce your need to explain, and focus on rebuilding self-respect. Not through confrontation, but through purification. Not to prove anything, but to return to your original state where your worth is not determined by how others react. Rebuilding from within is a lonely path. No applause, no apologies, no invitation back to your old place. But in that silence, you begin to see a crucial truth. You don't need the old place anymore, because now you're building something stronger, deeper, not reliant on spotlights or applause. A position no one can take away because no one gave it to you. Epictetus once said, "If you want to be respected, begin by respecting yourself." And that respect doesn't come from yelling that you deserve it. It comes from refusing to keep compromising on what makes you feel small. It comes from standing up, brushing off the dust of doubt, and continuing the inner work day by day, hour by hour, unseen by others, but clearly seen by you. Those who once lost their position but are humble enough not to blame, strong enough not to resent, and clear enough not to seek a scapegoat will return with double the weight. But this time, they won't need a seat at the table. They will be the seat others must adjust to sit beside. And you'll see, what you needed was never a place but an unshakable state of being. Let old wounds become fertile soil where you plant the seeds of self-mastery. Let the times you were dismissed forge your steadier gaze. Let the times you were cut off fuel your ability to speak only when necessary. Everything that once cost you your position now becomes the reason you'll never lose it again. And that doesn't need validation. It's etched into you like a silent pillar of new strength. And one day, you walk into a room without a word, and they know. You're no longer the same. Not because you dress differently, not because you talk differently, but because your steps no longer echo with doubt. You stand tall not to prove anything, but because you stopped bowing in your mind long ago. And if someone looks at you like they no longer recognize you, just smile. because they're right. You're no longer the one who sat silently in the corner, hoping someone would listen. You're the one who learned to listen to yourself and rebuilt that voice from the very place it was once taken. 17. Respect is not a reward. It is a consequence. There are people who spend their whole lives chasing respect from others, as if it were a negotiable prize. They wait, they hope, they change how they speak, how they walk, how they behave, just to be acknowledged the way they long for. But the more they seek respect from the outside, the more they lose it from within. Because the most respectable thing about a person is never what they demand, but what they generate through their quiet, steady, and self-possessed presence. A person who does not need respect is often the one most respected, not because they are arrogant, but because they live in a way that cannot be denied. They don't bow for approval, nor stretch to appear larger. They stand still like a stone in the middle of a rushing crowd, without demands, without justification, without haste. And it is that very stillness that creates a gravitational pull that causes others to adjust when near. Respect does not come from making others see you as worthy. It comes from living in a way that no one can define you but yourself. Marcus Aurelius once wrote something simple yet profound. One who lives in accordance with nature needs nothing more. That line was not to glorify detachment, but to emphasize this. Only when you're no longer pulled by others' expectations do you begin to attract what's truly meant for you. And respect is one of those things. It is not for those who try too hard to be seen. It comes to those who live by principles, who are unmoved by fleeting opinions, who do not shift with the crowd's emotions. True respect doesn't come from the praise said to your face, but from the things people dare not do behind your back. It's when you don't have to raise your voice, yet others instinctively know the boundary. It's when you walk into a room, not because anyone asked them to, but people naturally lower their tone. It's when you live without waving arguments around, yet every step you take makes others reflect. No one taught them to respect you. They simply couldn't not do it. You don't need to chase respect, nor can you control how others judge you. But you can absolutely control how you live. And when you live rightly, consistently, with a presence that does not compromise respect, will arrive as a consequence, not a privilege. It won't come fast, it won't come easily. But when it comes, it cannot be dismissed by hatred or jealousy, because people may dislike you, but they can't deny you. You don't need to fight for attention, because attention is like a stage light. It can turn on, and it can turn off. But respect is like the glow of a candle, quiet, not scorching, not flashy, but if someone comes close enough, they'll feel its warmth. That warmth doesn't come from fame, power, or poetic words. It comes from a core that cannot be faked. Self-possession, awareness, and a kind of dignity that no one can grant you and no one can take away. Respect comes late, but let it come as an inevitable outcome. And to do that, you don't need to please anyone. You only need to live true to the strongest, quietest, and most unshakable part of yourself. True respect does not arrive immediately, and it is never for the impatient. It comes slowly, silently, sometimes seeming as if it may never come. But if you are steadfast enough not to trade your identity just for recognition, then at some point, that respect will appear not as a reward, but as a quiet certification of the life you've lived. No applause, no ceremony, no words of tribute echoing, but the atmosphere around you begins to shift. And from that, everything else begins to change too. If, in the previous part, we understood that respect should not be sought, but lived in a way that cannot be denied, then this is the answer to something else, that what comes last when born from essence, will always outlast what came first through pretense. Some people are praised from the start because they know how to impress. But impressions fade. They are shallow and therefore easily washed away. In contrast, respect is built over time through silent observation, as people watch you remain unmoved through hardship, unbending when misunderstood, and unbroken even in isolation. And they are forced to acknowledge it even if they never speak it aloud. Seneca once said, "The most valuable recognition is the silent one." No one needs to declare their admiration for you, but they will start to speak differently when you're around. They won't be careless with words in your presence. They will weigh every reaction because they know you do not engage in petty games, and so they cannot drag you into them. You don't need authority. You don't need threats. You don't need performance. The fact that you don't need those things is precisely what makes others cautious. And from caution, they begin to recognize there is a boundary they shouldn't cross. That is the beginning of true respect. A person's status is not measured by the volume of their voice, but by the depth of silence they create. The one who is respected is not the one who speaks the loudest in the room, but the one whose mere presence causes the room to quiet down. That power does not come from titles or victories, but from a long journey of living honestly, enduring patiently, persisting without complaint, without excuse. And then one day, people realize you no longer need to stand at the center, which is exactly why no one can ignore you. There are kinds of power that no one can give you, but no one dares to take from you either. It is a nameless power built on principle, on discipline, on a self-respect no one taught you, but you learned through every scar. And that kind of power is the foundation for a kind of respect that cannot be shaken. It is not easy to earn and not easy to keep. But if you live deeply enough to have it, then no one shallow enough can take it away. Those who live by dignity will always be at a disadvantage at first, because they don't know how to scheme, don't know how to show off. But in the end, they will be the ones still standing when everything fake has faded. And by then, respect is no longer something they need, it's something others cannot help but offer. No applause needed, no spotlight, just one glance meeting theirs and bowing slightly enough to say, "Here stands someone who chose to live authentically, and because of that, no one dares treat them as ordinary again." 18. The most powerful person is the one who no longer needs to prove anything. There was a time when we lived as if every step we took had to be explained, every action a desperate attempt to be acknowledged. We spoke not just to express, but to affirm our existence. We argued not in search of truth, but from the fear of being misunderstood. We rushed into every conversation as if not saying enough, not trying hard enough, not proving ourselves enough would make our worth vanish into the world. But then comes a moment of stillness, a place where true freedom begins, when we no longer feel the need to prove anything at all. When you stop striving for recognition, something strange begins to happen. Others start to question themselves. In a world where everyone is desperate to speak, the one who stays silent stands out. Amid the crowd rushing to prove they're right, the one who no longer cares about being right becomes a mirror reflecting the crowd's insecurity. And from your silence, from your calm detachment, others are forced to ask, why do they need attention so badly? Why is their sense of existence tied to others' approval? And why don't you need it? When you no longer want to prove anything, you begin to live. Truly live not as a character waiting for applause, but as a whole being who knows their worth, even in silence. You stop feeling the need to respond to every attack, to correct every misunderstanding, to spend energy trying to change how others see you, because you now understand What makes you valuable doesn't depend on what they think, but how you live even when no one is watching. And from that, you begin to carry something that confuses others: detachment. Epictetus once said, "A free mind is not harmed by judgment." When you no longer need to prove yourself, you no longer fear being judged. And when you no longer fear judgment, you become unshakable. Others cannot provoke a battle if you refuse to engage. They cannot trigger you if you do not react. They cannot insult you if you don't grant them the power. And they cannot win because you're no longer playing the same game. The deepest freedom is realizing that recognition is no longer a need but a choice, and you've chosen not to need it. There is a kind of authority that comes not from volume, but from weight. The one who no longer needs to prove anything is the one who has accumulated too much experience to be in a rush. They know what's real and what's just noise. They don't need to shout to cover inner doubt. They don't need to speak at length to force belief. And because of that, they are no longer easily swayed. They don't need to say they're okay, because they live like someone who truly is. And that alone makes others reflect on the emptiness within themselves. When you're still trying to prove something, you're walking on borrowed energy, fueling your steps with others' approval. But when you no longer need that, you begin to move with your own internal power, and you start to see what you previously couldn't. Admiration is thin, but respect needs deep foundations. Applause doesn't mean you're right. Criticism doesn't mean you're wrong. And silence, if you learn to dwell in it, will become a voice louder than any justification. The world won't be pleased when you no longer react the way they expect. People will call you cold, arrogant, indifferent, but that's the price of freedom. The kind of freedom that isn't about doing anything you want, but not doing anything just to please others. And when you live from that freedom, you no longer need to prove. You only need to be present, and if your presence is steady enough, it will cause others to confront themselves even if you've never said a word. Once you're no longer pulled by the urge to prove, you enter a different kind of silence where no explanations are needed because the consistency of your life already speaks. And from that, you don't need words to assert your place. You show up and others feel it. You stay silent, but your presence makes people adjust. Not because you demanded it, but because they feel compelled to. And that doesn't come from words, it comes from a truth you've lived with long enough to make it part of your nature. Some speak because they have something to say, but others don't need to speak because everything necessary has been expressed through the way they live, the way they remain grounded, the way they don't overreact to trivial things. They don't live by promises, but by results. No need for debates, only time. No need for declarations, just quiet persistence in holding firm to their principles, no matter the circumstance. And for that, they are no longer just a person to be heard. They become a standard others must look up to, whether they want to or not. Truth, once lived deeply enough, needs no explanation. It radiates like a natural fact, like a boulder still standing after a flood, needing no words to prove its strength, because everything around it already does. And people are the same. When you have lived in alignment with what you believe, with what you practice, and have not betrayed your essence, you no longer need to explain your position. You have it. Not because you asked for it, but because you earned it. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Don't worry about what others think of you. Worry about what you think of yourself." That's not an invitation to selfishness, but liberation from the deepest chain. Dependence on others' perception to feel worthy. Once you've moved beyond that, you stop living to be affirmed and start living as someone who has already affirmed themselves through action, through choice, through discipline and dignity. And when you no longer live by words, you become living proof of an undeniable truth. Some use words to craft an image. Some use silence to build stature. And some need neither because their life itself is too authentic to imitate. They don't talk about integrity. They embody it. They don't preach respect, yet no one dares to belittle them. They don't explain their value, yet people instinctively treat them differently. They don't raise their voice to demand power. They simply hold on to dignity. And power emerges as something that cannot be faked. Their silence is not absence. It is essence. A quiet built from having walked through needless battles, having seen falsehoods collapse, and understanding the value of unwavering stillness. And from that stillness, they claim a position that no insult or slander can shake. Because that position isn't given, it's forged by truth, lived, not told. When you no longer need to prove anything, it means you've already walked through the fear of being misunderstood, the desire to be seen, and the temptation to contort yourself to fit others' expectations. You've chosen truth not easy, but undeniable. You've chosen depth not glamorous, but unshakable. And from there, you don't need to stand to be seen. You just need to keep walking and let each step be clear enough proof that the one who no longer needs to prove anything is the one who has lived rightly, so rightly that no further words are necessary. I once spent many years trying to prove something, that I was good enough, that I deserved respect, that I wasn't as weak as people thought. Every word, every reaction, every accomplishment was a way to convince the world that I had value. But the harder I tried, the more I felt drained. With every explanation, I felt like I was losing a part of myself. With every rebuttal, I realized I was letting others redraw the map of who I was. Then, one day, I went silent. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I no longer needed anyone to understand me in order for me to be myself. I withdrew from unnecessary debates. I stopped reacting to provocations wrapped in polite smiles. I stopped recounting what I'd been through, not because those things weren't important, but because I didn't need pity to define my worth. I learned this. True respect is not something you can request, and even less something you can force. It comes in the end as a result of living with enough depth, enough strength, and enough clarity that you no longer need anyone to validate you. And strangely, once you stop demanding it, it begins to appear. Not from everyone, but from the very few who are still enough to recognize this. There are people who don't need to speak much, but you can't help but listen to them. If you found value in this journey, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep philosophical reflection. Be the one who doesn't need to be heard, so your presence alone compels others to quiet down. No need to shout, no need to ask for permission, just be steady enough. See you in the next video.